Peasant Revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front 1975 to 1991 by Dr. John Young. Emergence of Modern Ethiopia. Three emperors, Tewodros, Yohannes, and Menelik, laid the foundation for the modern state of Ethiopia. Kasa, an Amhara Shifta leader, was crowned Emperor Tewodros in 1855 and brought the era of princes to a close by bringing the divided territories of the north under one rule. He also attempted to bring the church under his control and reduce the power of regional leaders by establishing local administrations responsible to him. But in the end, Tewodros failed in all his objectives. His self-inflicted death in 1868 created a struggle for power that was won by Dejazmach Kasai from Tigre, who took the name Emperor Yohannes IV. Yohannes pursued the goal of unity initiated by Tewodros, but his means were decidedly different. Unity was not to be achieved by overthrowing regional opponents, eliminating Islam, or taming the church, but instead by accepting a measure of cultural diversity and the existence of other centers of power, something which has been called controlled regionalism. The regional rivalry between the Tigrayan and Shoan monarchs was contained by the latter's public renunciation of any claims to be emperor, and Yohannes's corresponding recognition of Menelik as king of Shoa. The ascent of Yohannes, however, did not end the cultural dominance of the Amhara. Amharinya remained the language of his court, and Plowden, a contemporary European observer, noted, Tigray is now almost universally acquainted with the Amharic language, and their customs, food, and dress have become so assimilated to those of the Amharas as not to require separate description, though their hatred of that people is undiminished. While Yohannes fought invading Egyptians, Italians, and Mehdists on his northern borders, Menelik directed his energies at acquiring modern armaments and continuing Shoan expansion to the south. The southern expansion brought some of the most important caravan routes and markets within Shoa's borders, and they provided Menelik with the financial resources to purchase firearms. Armaments could also be acquired through diplomacy. Shortly after the Italians were defeated in 1887 at Dogali in now Eritrea by Yohannes's general Ras Alula, the Italians agreed in a secret treaty to supply Menelik with 5,000 Remington rifles and money, and also to recognize him as a sovereign power in return for his promise to assist Italy's colonial expansion. According to one Italian estimate, a total of 189,000 weapons were imported into Shoa from Italian Red Sea ports alone between 1885 and 1895, and most of them were acquired by Menelik. In the event, there was no ultimate battle between the contending monarchs, as Yohannes was killed fighting the Mehdists in 1889, and Menelik was quickly proclaimed emperor. The Italians gained Menelik's recognition of their sovereignty over Eritrea through the Treaty of Wichala signed on 2 May 1889, 2 months after Yohannes's death. Having furthered the colonial interests of the Italians, Menelik then attempted to contain their advance south, and in 1896 his armies defeated them at Adwa. However, by accepting the Treaty of Wichala and not taking advantage of the Adwa victory to force the Italians out of their Red Sea colony, or, according to his defenders, not having the resources to do so, Menelik provided a future generation of Eritrean nationalists with evidence of Ethiopia's rejection of claims to the territory. The loss of Eritrea with its Tigrania-speaking population was also the cause of lasting resentment in Tigray. Many Tigrayans today contend that Menelik did not take advantage of his Adwa victory and force the Italians out of their occupied lands, because that would serve to strengthen his chief competitors for state dominance, the descendants of Yohannes. But the immediate impact of the victory at Adwa was a modus operandi with the Italians in the north that allowed Menelik's armies to march into the Ogaden and spread further into the resource-rich Oromo lands of the south. In the 10 years following the Adwa victory, the armies of Menelik, together with his diplomatic successes with the adjacent colonial authorities, produced the Ethiopian boundaries that are largely in existence today. Ethiopia's expansion thus coincided with that of Europe's expansion in Africa, and, like the European created empires, it too was maintained by force over alien peoples. Unlike the imperial powers, however, Menelik and his successors have always attempted to legitimize this expansion by reference to Ethiopia's supposed historic borders. The brief assumption of power by Menelik's grandson Lijiasu with his Muslim sympathies, followed by a council of the nobility who overthrew him, through to Haile Selassie, did not change the basis of Shoan Amhara domination. In the south, captured lands were given to court and church favorites and to settlers from the north, who were encouraged to migrate to the region. Unlike the north, southern lands were fertile, suitable for valuable export crops like coffee, and their holders could be dispossessed. However, domination of the Abyssinians distorted the position of the northern peasant masses because they only belonged to this group in cultural and psychological terms. Thus, Tigray's increasingly destitute peasants derived few advantages from the southern expansion, and their small-holding, subsistence-based agriculture economy had few attractions when measured against the opportunities available in the south. The Abyssinian nobility, and particularly the Shoan branch, which dominated the state and held lands adjacent to the south, were the primary beneficiaries of the southern expansion. In the north, the decentralized governmental structure, together with the paucity of instruments available, and what Markakis has called the fanatical provincialism of the peasants, generally allowed the provincial nobility to successfully defend their autonomy. Tigray did not have Shoa's geocultural advantages nor the benefit of a stable dynasty until the advent of Emperor Yohannes, and in the view of most Tigrayans today, his descendants were denied their legitimate political inheritance by the Shoa nobility who had Menelik crowned on the basis of a disputed agreement. Instead, Tigray has suffered from the rivalries of its ruling factions and its locations in the northern highlands that has been the site of repeated invasions by Egyptians, Mehdis, and Italians. According to Ehrlich, some 20 major battles were fought on Tigrayan soil between the Battle of Adwa and the Italian invasion of 1935. The armies that fought these invaders and various rival Tigrayan factions were primarily made up of peasants who were forced to feed the armies and suffered the depredations of the wars they brought to their lands. With no salaries until the formation of a professional army in 1941, or even regular food supplies, it was common practice for soldiers to feed themselves at the expense of the peasants on whose land they traversed. Indeed, pillaging from the peasants and collecting war booty were the soldiers' chief incentives for joining the army. The Amhara and Tigrayans are closely related peoples ethnically, linguistically, and culturally. However, according to Markakis, Tigre alone represented continuity in Ethiopian culture, and this was in part a function of Tigray's inability to grow through assimilating neighboring peoples. Tigrinya speakers are typically highland sedentary Christian peasant farmers, and their neighbors were either Muslim herders inhabiting uninviting lowlands or members of the much larger Amhara people. Conversely, the Shoan branch of Amhara shared the central plateau with stateless Oromos, whom they found easier to either assimilate or dominate. Assimilation was facilitated by what Clapman calls the, quote, plasticity of Amhara ethnicity, end quote, and a kinship system which placed almost equal emphasis on maternal and paternal ties of descent. It was furthered by the practice of non-Amharas, primarily Oromos, taking Amhara personal names, which for the next generation became their last names. Amharaization was virtually complete if the individual in question also spoke Amharinia, accepted the Orthodox Church, and assumed Amhara manners. On this basis and through political marriages and alliances, Oromo nobles started becoming important political leaders and generals in Showa, and in time many commoners were also assimilated. The result is that there are few Amharas, particularly among those from Showa, who lived on the borderlands of the Oromos that do not have some Oromo blood in them, a process which has not occurred among Tigrayans. On this basis, Clapman has argued that the Ethiopian system of political leadership cannot be considered ethnically exclusive. He does, however, acknowledge that hierarchical structured Ethiopian governments have been weak at accepting groups that wish to maintain their own distinctiveness, and further that there has been a greater problem in incorporating Eritreans and Tigrayans because of practical considerations of political reliability. While Clapman's explanation, in conjunction with other factors, helps to understand the limited appeal until recently of Oromo nationalism, it allows him to dispense with the ethnic cleavage as something transient. What Clapman fails to acknowledge is that subject peoples under the Shoan monarchies could only gain acceptance within the dominant culture by committing what Keller has called cultural suicide. Like his predecessors, Haile Selassie concentrated on the centralization of the empire, and this allowed little scope for any policy of integration of the nationalities beyond the selective incorporation of ethnic elites through Amharization. Instead, through personal patronage, land tenure, and land tax reforms, the emperor sought to modernize his regime by undermining the traditional power of the northern autocrats. To the extent that these measures were effective, they reformed the administrative links between center and periphery, and hence increased the power of the emperor, without, however, fundamentally altering the character of Shoan rule. In Shoan-dominated Abyssinia, all regions opposed state centralization, but it is significant that by the time of the reign of Haile Selassie, only in Tigray did hereditary leaders still rule. The Shoan emperors reduced Tigray to a semi-autonomous buffer region, but they were never able to fully control it or deprive its leading families of their centuries-old supremacy. As a result, Amhara emperors had to depend on local leaders and continue the ancient practice of building political loyalty through dynastic marriages in the province. Under Haile Selassie, this largely took the form of marriages between his family and those of the descendants of Johannes. Nobility is primarily a function of titles which are conferred by the emperor and are not inheritable, but some families, such as that of Johannes, have retained titles for generations. Although the Tigrayan nobility could unite to defend the province against the Shoans, they were often divided among themselves. Gebru Tareke has speculated that the regional nobilities of Shoa and Gojam were not as disunited as those of Tigray because they did not have as many segments and their political history was shorter and thus not as well established as that of the Tigrayans. The Tigrayan nobles, the internal divisions, were also encouraged by the Shoans, so they could achieve an internal balance and prevent any of Johannes' descendants from becoming the Negus, or king of Tigray. On the eve of the Second World War, Emperor Haile Selassie continued Menelik's attempt to undermine Tigrayan autonomy by dividing authority in the provinces between two rival descendants of Johannes, Dejazmach Haile Selassie Gugsa, who administered eastern Tigray, and Ras Seyum Mengesha, who administered western Tigray. The system, however, was open to manipulation by the Italian administration in neighboring Eritrea, who had harboring designs on Ethiopia since their defeat at Adwa, and with the rise of Mussolini, they pursued a more aggressive Ethiopian policy. In exchange for ensuring an unopposed route for their invading army through his territory, Italian officials promised Haile Selassie Gugsa that they would appoint him sole leader of Tigray after their takeover of the province. The Dejazmach's treachery strengthened the Italians' resolve to invade Ethiopia, while the historical pattern of core region power struggles convinced the British and other foreign observers that Ethiopia's disintegration was inevitable. As a result, the British concluded that it would be mistaken to support Ethiopia's integrity and therefore agreed to an Italian protectorate over the country. Environmental stress, famine, and the inability of the province's political leaders and traditional institutions to cope with the problem also figured in Tigray's decline. It had not always been this way. Northern Ethiopia was once rich in agricultural resources and provided a well-balanced diet for its inhabitants. The Scottish explorer James Bruce, who visited the country in late 18th century, wrote that peasants in the region of the Tigrayan town of Adwa grew 3 crops a year without the benefit of manure, and they presented a rich appearance to the visitor. In the 1820s, Nathaniel Pierce reported seeing a great many elephants in the depths of the forest near Adwa. However, less than 4 decades later, during the construction of a telegraph line for the army of General Napier, it was reported that in parts of Tigray it was virtually impossible to find trees that could be used as poles, and peasants were selling the British timbers from their own houses. Ethiopian peasants endured the largest number of recorded famines in Africa, and there were few famines which did not include Tigray. The most destructive famine to afflict Ethiopia in recorded history was that of 1888 to 92, which began with a rinderpest plague caused by the importation of infected cattle to Massawa, but it soon affected all of Ethiopia and sub-Saharan Africa. Its impact was more severe and longer in the north, according to Catholic missionaries, who witnessed continuing near-famine conditions in Tigray as late as 1908. In the period between the death of Johannes in 1889 and the present day, an estimated 17 famines have struck Tigray, the biggest being in 1958 to 9, 1965 to 6, 1972 to 74, and 1983 to 84. In spite of the impact of the famine of 1888, there appeared to be a steady increase in population in northern Ethiopia, and this served to intensify land use in older settled areas, encourage settlement in lower altitude zones, which sometimes led to conflict with the peoples inhabiting those areas, and caused the destruction of some of the most accessible pasturage and forests. Although there is no disagreement that deforestation and environmental degradation are major problems in Ethiopia, particularly in the northern highlands, there is a difference of opinion on when these problems arose. Appreciating the intimate connection between government and famine, James Bruce noted the impact of vermin in precipitating famine, but concluded that to these plagues may be added still one, the greatest of them all, bad government, which speedily destroys all the advantages they reap from nature, climate, and situation. Although the peasants were instructed by the church that famine was a manifestation of divine retribution, in Tigray there was a national dimension to the people's suffering since the rulers were from another nation. The loss of power by the descendants of Johannes to the Amhara nobility served to heighten the people's sense of national grievance and to link the misfortune of their homeland to its political emasculation and to blame Amhara domination for their misery. Tigray's entry into the modern world. With the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, forces were set in motion that not only led directly to the 1943 anti-state revolt of the Tigrayan peasants, but also initiated the process of modernization. Connor has aptly described modernization as that amalgam of sub-processes including the industrialization, urbanization, increasing literacy, intensified communication, and transportation networks, and the like. Modernization also leaves in its wake economic dislocation, new patterns and ways of life, the questioning of old identities as the new ones take form, and increasing challenges to political institutions. As a result of the invasion, Ethiopia, together with Italian Somaliland and Eritrea, became part of the African Oriental Italiana. Under Italian rule, the country was divided into four governorships: Amhara, Harar, Oromo Sidamo, and Shoa, while Tigray was attached to Eritrea. Prior to the invasion, the Italians had made much for propaganda purposes of Ethiopia's backwardness, oppression of the non-Amhara peoples, and Haile Selassie's failure to eliminate slavery. The Italians did eliminate slavery. The privileged status of the Neftgenas, or northern settlers in the southern lands, was reduced, and schools were built that provided instruction in the indigenous tongues of the area and not exclusively in Amharinia, as was the practice under the imperial regime. The Italians' administrative restructuring served to undermine but not do away with the role of nobles in local government. The new rulers also attempted to dissolve the land holdings of the clergy, letting these lands return to the people, while the priests were sometimes put on monthly salaries. Such reforms were generally welcomed by Ethiopia's heavily taxed peasants. A Tigrayan elder described the Italian occupation as a period when the people were getting rest, peace, and freedom from the imperial government. Italian stimulated modernization served to lay the basis of modern economic infrastructure in Ethiopia. This included the spread of wage labor as Italian settlers established commercial farms and the creation of 40 agriculture enterprises, 1,436 commercial companies, and 1,225 industrial firms. During their brief rule, the Italians built 4,000 miles of roads and, with their defeat, left behind machinery, lorries, factories, public buildings, and many settlers. In Tigray, the town of Adwa in particular benefited from Italian rule as it was made an administrative capital, and townspeople reported they were busy night and day making and providing things to sell to the Italians. But modernization of the economy also brought about the decline of the town's traditional industries, such as the centuries-old mule caravan trade. Moreover, with the defeat of the Italians, Adwa lost its favored status. The return of Haile Selassie in 1941 from exile in the company of British imperial troops set the stage for a major revolt in eastern Tigray. Tigrayan loyalties had been tested by the war when a number of local nobles actively supported the Italians. The occupiers gained the acquiescence, if not always the support, of sections of the population by reducing the number and amount of taxes, and by building badly needed schools, hospitals, and roads. Tigrayan acceptance of the Italian invaders and hostility to the incoming imperial regime was also facilitated by Haile Selassie's defensive strategy of abandoning the province to the invaders during the retreat of 1935. Aware of his insecure position, Haile Selassie was anxious to reassert control in the province, but his officials were challenged when they attempted to collect taxes. Although the emperor abolished much of the pre-war taxes and services, peasants complained that the taxes were still far higher than those imposed by the Italian administration. What particularly angered the peasants, however, was that in contrast to earlier practice, Haile Selassie insisted that taxes be paid in cash and not in kind, a severe imposition given the subsistence character of most Tigrayan agriculture. Moreover, taxes were collected by corrupt assessors accompanied by irregular troops known as territorials who became notorious for robbery and violence. Angered by Haile Selassie's new administration of Amhara officials, Tigrayan nobles encouraged peasant resistance and gave it a populist, anti-Shoan character. In the unsettled conditions prevailing in the wake of the Italian administration's collapse, these factors alone would have caused public disorder. The situation was further aggravated by the occupying British Army's goal after 1941 of removing Tigray from the emperor's control and attaching the province to Eritrea. In pursuit of their efforts, and as a means to contain the spreading anarchy, they encouraged Tigrayan sectarianism and built up the authority of Tigray's hereditary leaders, notably Ras Seyu Mengesha, who they pressed the emperor to appoint governor of the province. Haile Selassie eventually agreed to the appointment but kept Seyum under observation in Addis Ababa until 1947. The emperor faced a dilemma. The appointment of Tigrayan nobles to positions of leadership might encourage stability in the province, but as a Shoan Amhara ruler, he was anxious about raising the status of his historical competitors, and at the same time he had reason to be suspicious of British intentions. Haile Selassie was also confronted by a number of rebellious minority communities in southeastern Tigray who attempted to escape state encroachment at a time when the imperial regime was weak. Foremost were the Raya and Azibo people, who were originally Oromo and constituted a Muslim minority community in the heartland of Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. Moreover, they had fiercely resisted Abyssinian incorporation and struggled to retain their semi-nomadic clan-based egalitarian culture. On the eve of the 1935 invasion, the Italians provided the Raya and Azibo with several thousand rifles, which they used very effectively against the retreating imperial army. Haile Selassie considered their actions traitorous, and the stage was set for post-war conflict. A neighboring people, the Gujarat, also had a long history of militantly opposing state efforts to impose local administrators and the Risti system of land tenure. The Gujarat were mostly Christian peasant farmers, spoke a Tigrinya dialect, and practiced a system of tenure in which land belonged to the entire community and land rights flowed from permanent residents, unlike the lineage-based system practiced by most Tigrayans. Feudal incorporation threatened to impose outside authority in local affairs and brought about the destruction of their land tenure system and decentralized forms of government. In 1942, the state did impose a chikashum, or local administrator, over them, and this served as one of the precipitating causes for their conflict with the central government. Minorities' resistance to incorporation, inter- and intra-feudal jockeying for power, dislocation involved in the transitional period, and the violence of the territorials all fostered an upsurge in Shifta activity. Shifta were not homogeneous. Some were basically criminals engaged in looting both peasants and nobles alike, but others were peasants deeply angered at their conditions, and their discontent was in essence the peasants' discontent. Most of the latter group joined the rebellion, or WWII, and one of them, an aggrieved local official turned Shifta, Blata Haile Mariam Ridda, became its principal leader. Public disobedience, whether of a criminal or political nature, was expedited by the wide availability of weaponry in a region that had only recently witnessed anti-government skirmishes and had been the site of many battles over the previous 65 years. After a series of battles beginning 22nd May 1943 that left the WWII rebels in control of the provincial capital Mekelle and most of eastern Tigray, they focused their efforts on the government stronghold of Amba Alage. However, after 3 weeks of increasingly bitter attacks, the army, with the assistance of British officials and aerial bombardment, was victorious in October. Government retribution was quick and severe. The territorials spread violence throughout Tigray, fines were levied, homesteads destroyed, and cattle confiscated. Of more long-term significance, the Raya and Azibo, who had been in the forefront of the rebellion, had their land taken away and were made tenants on it. Tigray's boundaries were also redrawn, and the area they inhabited was assigned to Wolo.